The courthouse was quiet, a silence so thick that even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed intrusive. Rows of wooden benches lined the small room, their varnish chipped from decades of restless hands and nervous shuffling. At the far end sat Judge Horace Whitfield, elevated on his bench like a king on a throne, his robe draped heavily across his broad shoulders. His gavel rested within reach, though it was rarely necessary. His voice alone carried enough weight to silence a room. Standing before him was Marcus Hayes, a tall black man with an unshakable calm. He wore a plain charcoal suit, his polished shoes reflecting faint flecks of light from the high windows. To the untrained eye, Marcus looked like any other defendant, an ordinary man caught in an ordinary dispute. Yet his eyes told another story. They held the quiet assurance of someone who knew more than he revealed. Whitfield barely glanced at the file before him. He didn't need to. He had already decided. In his mind, Marcus was just another black man to be taught a lesson, another reminder of who held the real power in this courtroom. He leaned back, smirk curling at the corner of his mouth, already savoring the fine he would impose, but the judge was making a grave mistake. What he saw as an easy dismissal of dignity was about to become the turning point of his career. Marcus Hayes was no ordinary defendant. He was a federal prosecutor, a man who had stood in the most respected courtrooms in the nation, dismantling criminal empires, holding corporate giants accountable, and upholding the principles of justice at the highest level. He hadn't come here to announce his title. He hadn't come to boast or intimidate. He had come as a citizen, willing to submit to the same process as anyone else. Yet soon, the truth would surface, and when it did, the scales of power would swing so violently that everyone in the room would feel the shift. This was not just another day in court. This was the day a racist judge would learn that justice has many faces, and sometimes, it looks back at you from the defendant's table. Ashwood County's courthouse was more relic than institution, a red brick monument to traditions that had outlived their usefulness. The building, constructed in the late 19th century, had seen generations shuffle through its halls. Its heavy oak doors opened onto marble steps worn thin by time, and its corridors echoed with the footsteps of lawyers, defendants, and jurors who carried their private hopes and fears into public judgment. For more than 2 decades, Judge Horace Whitfield had presided here. To the town, he was more than a judge, he was a figure of continuity, a man whose words shaped both law and culture. His rulings were said to keep order in a world where change came too quickly for comfort. But for those who paid attention, patterns were impossible to ignore. Harsh sentences were delivered with unnerving frequency to people who didn't fit his vision of respectability. Defendants of color left his courtroom with heavier fines, stricter conditions, and colder words than their white counterparts. The whispers about his prejudice were never spoken loudly. Ashwood was the kind of town where whispers were enough to ruin reputations, and most people could not afford to provoke a man of his authority. Those who objected too openly soon found themselves ostracized, their businesses struggling, their children overlooked in school opportunities. Whitfield's power extended far beyond the bench. Marcus Hayes knew all of this when he walked into the courthouse. Though he didn't live in Ashwood, he had grown up in a neighboring county. He knew the way men like Whitfield operated, wrapping their biases in the veneer of law. Marcus had no illusions about how he would be perceived. A black man standing alone in a small-town courtroom, his suit modest, his file unremarkable, it was the perfect setup for Whitfield to assert his authority. The charge itself was trivial. A traffic citation that had snowballed due to clerical mishandling. A supposed failure to yield at an intersection, compounded by lost paperwork, had become a mandatory court appearance. Marcus could have simply paid the fine, shrugged it off as an inconvenience. But he believed in principles. If the system demanded his presence, he would comply, not as someone seeking special treatment but as a citizen respecting the law. The townspeople who filled the benches studied him with curiosity. Few outsiders came through Ashwood's courthouse, and fewer still carried themselves with such quiet dignity. Marcus didn't fidget, didn't shrink under the scrutiny. He stood tall, his posture firm, his eyes steady. His silence drew whispers. Who was this man who seemed so composed in front of Judge Whitfield? Whitfield studied him with a practiced air of disdain. The judge leaned back, as though already bored, eyes flicking over the file without interest. He saw no lawyer standing beside Marcus. No family sitting in support. Just a solitary figure awaiting judgment. To Whitfield, the outcome was obvious. The clerk read the charge, her voice mechanical, echoing off the high ceiling. Marcus listened with the patience of someone who had heard far weightier charges read in far larger courtrooms. He understood what was happening. This was not about a traffic violation. This was about perception, about a man on the bench deciding that dignity was something to be rationed. Marcus's mind moved beyond the moment. He thought of the countless defendants he had prosecuted who believed the system was stacked against them. He remembered the fear in their eyes, the hopelessness in their shoulders. He had seen judges who rose above bias, but he had also seen judges like Whitfield, cloaked in power but transparent in their prejudice that he felt no fear. Instead, he felt the weight of irony. Here he was, a federal prosecutor, standing as a defendant in a courtroom where the scales of justice were already tilted. He could reveal his identity at any moment, end the charade with a few words. But he chose silence. Not out of pride, but out of principle. He wanted to see the process unfold, to experience firsthand what so many others endured. The gallery leaned forward, waiting for the judge to speak. Whitfield's smirk deepened. He was ready to lecture, ready to impose his fine, ready to dismiss Marcus as another example. But in his arrogance, Whitfield had no idea how close he was to appending his own world. The judge began with his familiar ritual, a condescending speech about responsibility and respect for the law. His words dripped with superiority, framed as wisdom but delivered as judgment. Marcus listened without reaction, his face unreadable. To the gallery, it appeared as though the man was simply enduring the inevitable. To Marcus, it was confirmation of what he already knew: this courtroom was not about justice, but control. Whitfield raised the fine well beyond what the infraction warranted. He added court fees, administrative charges, and penalties that stacked together into an amount that would burden any ordinary person. The figure rolled off his tongue with satisfaction, punctuated by the sharp rap of his gavel. The decision, in his mind, was final. Whispers rippled through the room. Even those accustomed to Whitfield's severity recognized the excess. The defendant had barely been allowed to speak, and the punishment far outweighed the supposed violation. Yet no one dared to object. This was how things worked in Ashwood. Marcus, however, remained unshaken. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder, setting it calmly on the defendant's table. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. Whitfield noticed, his smirk faltering just slightly as curiosity pricked at his arrogance. The folder contained documents, credentials, federal identification, case records bearing Marcus's name. He did not wave them dramatically. He did not boast. He simply placed them where they could be seen if the court chose to look. The clerk's eyes widened first. She leaned closer, scanning the heading on the first page. Her hands trembled slightly as realization dawned. She looked up at Marcus, then at the judge, uncertain whether to speak. Whitfield noticed her hesitation and scowled. "What is it?" he snapped. The clerk hesitated, then spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry. She read the title on the document. United States Department of Justice. Office of the Federal Prosecutor. Marcus D. Hayes. The words landed like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted in whispers, the sound swelling until Whitfield's gavel banged repeatedly for silence. His face flushed crimson, his composure unraveling. He leaned forward, snatching the folder from the clerk with trembling hands. His eyes darted over the pages, disbelief giving way to panic. There, in black and white, was the truth he had ignored. The man he had just fined and humiliated was not a helpless defendant. He was a federal prosecutor, a man whose career embodied the very law Whitfield had twisted for his own biases. Marcus remained silent, his gaze steady, his expression calm. He did not need to speak. The documents spoke for him. The judge stammered, his voice faltering as he attempted to regain control. He mumbled about procedure, about misunderstandings, but the gallery had already seen the truth. The power dynamic had shifted. Whitfield, once towering in authority, now appeared small, desperate, exposed. The whispers in the room carried judgment of their own. Townspeople who had long suspected Whitfield's prejudice now had proof of his arrogance. He had tried to diminish a man who held far greater authority than himself. Marcus finally spoke, his voice measured, calm. He did not raise it, yet it carried effortlessly through the hushed room. He spoke not of revenge, not of personal insult, but of principle. He reminded the court that justice was not about appearances, not about assumptions, but about fairness applied equally to all. The gallery listened in silence, captivated. His words carried weight not because of his title, but because of his integrity. He had endured the judge's arrogance without revealing his hand, and when the truth emerged, he chose dignity over vengeance. Whitfield slumped back in his chair, his authority shattered. The gavel, once his weapon of control, now seemed like a hollow prop. He could not undo what had been revealed. The turning point had arrived. The tension that had built throughout the hearing now erupted in a reversal so complete that the room itself seemed transformed. The judge who had once commanded silence now struggled to maintain his own composure. The defendant who had once appeared vulnerable now stood as the embodiment of justice. Marcus outlined, without boast, the nature of his work. He spoke of the federal cases he had prosecuted, of the principles that guided him, of the countless times he had argued not for punishment but for fairness. He emphasized that he had come today not as a prosecutor but as a citizen, willing to stand before the law like anyone else. The power of his words lay in their restraint. He did not humiliate the judge. He did not seek to embarrass him further. Instead, he turned the moment into a lesson, not only for Whitfield but for everyone watching. Justice, Marcus said quietly, does not belong to the man who holds the gavel. It belongs to the people it serves. The gallery sat in silence, the truth sinking deep. For years, they had watched Whitfield rule with arrogance. For years, they had accepted it as unchangeable. Now they saw, in stark relief, that authority could be challenged, not by anger but by dignity. Whitfield's hands trembled as he attempted to speak. His words faltered, excuses tumbling over each other. But the damage was done. The room no longer respected him. The very people who had once feared his rulings now looked at him with something different, contempt. The climax reached its peak when Marcus closed the folder and calmly walked away from the table. He had no need to stay. His point had been made, not through confrontation but through revelation. The judge's authority lay broken, his prejudice laid bare for all to see. In the days that followed, the story spread far beyond the walls of Ashwood's courthouse. Word traveled quickly, carried on whispers, repeated in diners, recounted in barbershops. People spoke of the man who had stood calmly before Judge Whitfield, endured his arrogance, and revealed himself not as a powerless defendant but as a federal prosecutor. The incident sparked conversations the town had avoided for years. Some defended Whitfield, clinging to the comfort of old authority. But many more questioned aloud what they had long suspected. Was justice truly being served in Ashwood, or had it been bent to the will of a man who confused power with fairness? Marcus returned to his life, his work demanding and unrelenting. He did not dwell on the incident, but he carried with him the memory of what had unfolded. For him, it was not a personal victory but a reminder of why he did what he did. Justice mattered. Fairness mattered. The dignity of every person who entered a courtroom mattered. Whitfield, on the other hand, never recovered. His authority weakened, his rulings scrutinized, his legacy tarnished. In time, investigations began, spurred by the exposure of his arrogance. The gavel that had once been his weapon now felt like a weight he could not bear. The true impact, however, lay not in Whitfield's downfall but in the awakening of those who had witnessed the moment. They saw, perhaps for the first time, that dignity could resist prejudice, that silence could be powerful when paired with truth, and that justice, though often delayed, could still find its way through the cracks of arrogance. As for Marcus, he continued his work, guided by the same principles that had carried him through that day. He knew the fight for fairness was never finished. But he also knew that every moment of truth mattered, even in a small courthouse in Ashwood County, and so the story closed, not with vengeance, but with a question left for all who heard it. When the scales of justice tilt unfairly, will you accept the weight, or will you stand, like Marcus Hayes, and let truth reveal itself?